I knew Jim Garrison. I met Jim Garrison in 1969 after the Clayshaw trial. You would never have known that Jim Garrison had lost a major trial. He considered it just one more event in the long history of his investigation. All he did was talk about the case. You would not have known that he was district attorney of Rawlins Parish. You would not know that he was coming up for re-election. This was May, the coming November. His only interest was the Kennedy case. When Jim Garrison was indicted by the federal government for taking bribes from illegal pinball interests, gambling interests, pinball was legal, but gambling with pinball machines was not legal, and he was really suffering because he was framed by a person whom he considered a friend, whose name was Pershing Gervais, whom he had known since the days when he was in the Army. And I wanted to write a book then, and I was going to call it The Ordeal of Jim Garrison. And I began to do interviews, and then I stopped. I wrote books about movies, I wrote true crime, I wrote a novel, I wrote biographies. And it was only after I wrote biographies, particularly the Hellman and Hammett, Lillian Hellman and Dashiell Hammett, that I thought I had the technique and the skills to write the biography of Jim Garrison. And it never left me. Now Jim Garrison had died in 1992. So I began again in 1997 working on this book. It was first a biography of Jim Garrison. Then it became a biography of his investigation. Then it became a book about the Kennedy assassination because I did more than 1,000 interviews. I looked over the hundreds of thousands of pages from the National Archives, not only about Garrison and the Garrison case, but also the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board papers, the Metropolitan Crime Commission papers, all the CIA, all the FBI field office releases out of New Orleans. And I felt I was able to write this. Garrison solved the murder from the day he started, and the rest was corroboration. He looked at the Warren volumes, the 26 volumes and the report, and he saw something about Oswald. Oswald was not what he seemed. That it was very likely, Garrison thought, that Oswald was a false defector, that he had not defected to the Soviet Union, that he was not a Marxist, that he was learning Russian under the auspices of the American military, and that in fact he was with CIA. And as Garrison put it in his sardonic way, because he's great sardonic humor, he was never seen with anyone who was not with CIA. And he was referring, of course, to the many sightings of Oswald with Clay Shaw, who had a long intelligence background, and we know that Shaw was with the Operations Division of CIA now, and we can prove it in a way that Garrison couldn't. And Oswald was seen constantly with David Ferry, who was a contract CIA employee. And from that moment, Garrison investigated and found confirmation over confirmation, in particular Oswald's association with Guy Bannister, and the fact that Oswald used the upstairs room at Guy Bannister's detective agency for his leaflets and like a little office. What is Oswald doing with someone like Guy Bannister, the former special agent in charge in the field office in Chicago, and a person with intelligence connections with Office of Naval Intelligence and with CIA? And this is confirmed by people, even Bannister's former partner, Joe Oster, very legitimate people, very reliable people. And Garrison went on, and he developed more and more evidence. One of the biggest finds, one of the biggest victories that I had in my own investigation was to find a man named Thomas Edward Beckham, who was groomed by CIA to be an alternate scapegoat for the murder of President Kennedy. And I think that pretty much proves who planned the crime if we can see who's setting up the scapegoats. Beckham was associated with Bannister as well. He was a runner for Bannister. His handler was a man named Jack Martin, whose CIA affiliations have been revealed only in the very last CIA releases in 2002 to the National Archives. Martin was Beckham's handler. He gave him a post office box at the very same federal post office building where Oswald had his. And one day Beckham received an air ticket to Langley, Virginia. And he went to be trained by CIA. And CIA, and Beckham gave me a document which is so similar to the documents that CIA has since released to the Church Committee about the kind of assassins that they were looking for to use in the murder, for example, of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, because the Church Committee, of course, dealt with the murder of foreign leaders. And here we have this document in which Beckham is described as someone who doesn't mind killing. He was one of 5 sons and therefore dispensable. Nobody would care what happened to him. And many of the soldiers of fortune who were involved in the sabotage of Cuba said the same thing. Nobody would care if anything happened to me. People with no families. These were the kind of people that CIA liked to use if they could get them.
How is Beckham allowed to live?
He ran. His handler protected him. He was on the run for all these almost 30 years. He was very young. Somehow he survived. They thought no one would believe him. What happened was he came to Garrison's grand jury, and he lied and lied, and his handler Chrisman said, if you say anything that will get me into trouble, you'll be dead. He had more to fear from the CIA and the people that set him up than from anyone else. And he lied and lied.
You just think that...
And Garrison called him the day after his grand jury appearance. No one knows about this. He told me this first time. And Jim said, well, do you have anything else to tell me? He was really humbling himself before this witness who really was no better than he was. And he said, no, Mr. Garrison, I don't know what you're talking about. Now, when I went to see him, this is so many years later, he said, I wish I could have told him. I wish Garrison were alive so I could tell him how close he was. And when I heard that, that was the last line of my book.
Oh, that's great. Where were you when it happened? I'm asking everybody that. And, you know,
I was a student, a graduate student at the City University of New York, trying to get my PhD, working under one of the great literary figures of this century, literary critics, Irving Howe, who wrote the book The World of Our Fathers, and many other books, too. I was at home doing my homework, where I always was, and there it is on television. President Kennedy was dead. But I have to say that what I remember about that time, well, 2 things. I remember that how outraged I was at the murder of Diem, the president of South Vietnam at the time. Now, I was very much against the war all the time, but I thought that was outrageous, and I thought that Kennedy was responsible for it. We all thought that, and that he was getting just what he was giving out to others, so it came back to him. And I think I even used the phrase, I have to tell you, he who lives by the sword, which was later said publicly by Malcolm X. I was, like many people, I thought John F. Kennedy would be, he seemed like a wonderful addition to the American political scene, but he lied about what he was going to do. He said, for example, this meant a lot to me as a young liberal person at the time. This was the time of the civil rights movement. And John F. Kennedy said he was going to desegregate federal-sponsored housing. It seems like a very modest ambition now, but at the time, this was still the time of segregation. We're not into integration yet. And he didn't do it. He did not do it. And after that, I lost faith in him. I am not one of those people who see him as a saint, a martyr, the great man. I think we should feel the same way were any president shot down in the streets. Not a beautiful one with a shock of golden hair. I saw him give a campaign speech once on Fordham Road in the Bronx, and he was astonishing. He was a dazzling figure. The loud, clear, lucid voice, the wit, the smile, the tan, which we now know was something connected with the medication for Addison's disease, but whatever. He was, and I think in later years, I met Mrs. Kennedy, then Mrs. Onassis, and she too was, many years later, she was an older woman, an astonishing beauty, more than even one could imagine when we saw her picture. She was very beautiful. So these were a golden couple, weren't they? But that doesn't mean we should feel sentimentality about this president and how the world would have changed. The fact is that President Kennedy was against a ground war in Vietnam. He preferred Phoenix programs, Green Berets, which were lethal, murderous people, and he sent 16,000 of those people into Vietnam. He did not want the ground war because of what it would cost the economy of the United States, which is legitimate. Look at our deficit now and these war in Iraq. But to say that he was peace-loving and that he didn't believe in the Vietnam War, it was not true. He just wanted to do it a little differently. And then Robert Kennedy gave an interview to Daniel Ellsberg at the time and said, what my brother would have wanted, I'm pretty sure, was the kind of coalition government that we had in Laos, where you had death squads, liberals, communists, the monarchists, all together. And of course, that was no solution at all. That led to hunting down of people that were not on the right. It was not a pretty solution. But Kennedy was not someone who believed in the flowering of democracy. If he did, he would have abided by the Geneva Conventions, which mandated an election in 1956 in Vietnam. But we don't have to love John F. Kennedy in order to want to know who killed him and not want to live in a society where perhaps elements of government shoot down the president in the street and has had so much consequence. As Cyril West said, was a coup d'etat. And I believe that that was true, that the government changes after the Kennedy assassination. And one of the soldiers of fortune, named Gerald Patrick Hemming, well known in the research community, said to me when I interviewed him, John F. Kennedy was the last president who thought he could take power. If we look at a little of the history, we see President Eisenhower humiliated by CIA in the U-2 incident just before the summit, which would have meant a détente with the Soviet Union. And that was what Eisenhower wanted to be the crowning achievement of his presidency. And CIA thwarts that by sending that last U-2 in, perhaps sabotaging the plane, giving out advanced intelligence, perhaps through Oswald, who was in the Soviet Union at the time, that Francis Gary Powers U-2 goes down. And after that, we have presidents who really are taking orders from the military and the intelligence agencies, which are the one arm of the American military.
Do you think Johnson was involved?
I read the book by Barr McClellan, and I think it's widely overstated. And I think when you do a book like that, 40 years after the fact, you have to reconcile the evidence that you have with the existing evidence, the things that we do know, and connect the two. We can't just suddenly say, now here's a completely new view, and ignore all the evidence that we have. I don't believe that Lyndon Johnson and his lawyer, Ed Clark, together conspired and created this massive plot to kill President Kennedy. Whether the assassin who I gather, and I did believe one thing from Barr McClellan's book, and that is that Johnson was behind many murders in Texas in order to ensure his political success. And the assassin whom Johnson used was a man named Mac Wallace, whose fingerprint may have been on one of the boxes in the Texas School Book Depository. Little finger seems to match. Well, if it does, it may very well be that the Johnson group contributed to the CIA's planning of the assassination, one of the hired killers whom they had used for other such jobs. But to say that Lyndon Johnson and his lawyer were behind, and I think Barr McClellan said on one of the television stations, Lyndon Johnson murdered President Kennedy. That's just not true. I don't believe it. What about all the Louisiana evidence that I've been looking at? Doesn't fit into that. Now we have David Ferry. How I want to get away from that Lyndon Johnson scenario. David Ferry suddenly takes off from New Orleans on that weekend, on Friday, and where does he go? To Houston and to Galveston. Well, many people have speculated that Ferry was really sent there to fly Oswald out, and that Oswald was waiting for him in the Texas theater. And the reason that Ferry took two of his confrères with him in the car was to drive the car back to Louisiana.
JFK.
I want to say one thing as a preface to the movie JFK. What we had in the late 1990s was the Assassination Records and Review Board, which came as a result of the JFK Act, which allowed for the dissemination of FBI, CIA, and many other files, which were a result of Oliver Stone's lobbying, which were because he was criticized so much for the movie JFK. If not for Jim Garrison, there would be no movie JFK, and therefore no JFK Act releasing the records, and no Assassination Records and Review Board. Whatever its limitations, it certainly contributed many files to the case. Now, I think that the agency went wild when Oliver Stone decided to make that movie. The attacks in the New York Times for months before the film even emerged. Why are they so excited if there's no truth behind Garrison's investigation? Garrison was the person that they feared. They love it when people talk about the minutiae. Was there a wound here in the head, and the fake photograph and the fake x-ray, and the doctors were no good, and these doctors contradicted those doctors? What does it all come to? But Jim Garrison, from the day he started, he thought he knew who the plotters of this crime were. And he went out and tried to prove it and did a very good job. Sure, there were some blind leads. Sure, in any investigation, sometimes you go down a path and it doesn't lead anywhere. It came right back and started again. He had very few resources, I think $90,000, compared to the millions that were spent on the other investigations. And he emerged with so many leads that if those leads were really followed, as they were not by the House Select Committee, because once Robert Blakey and Gary Cornwell came in, they stopped the investigation cold. They signed an agreement with CIA CIA from the day Robert Blakey took office, and those letters of agreement are in the National Archives, and then the Louisiana team was stopped short, and Gary Cornwell prevented them from following the leads. For example, in Jackson and Clinton, where we see Oswald Shore and Ferry, they were forbidden to follow those leads, and they were even punished. They gave a polygraph, by the way, to Thomas Edward Beckham, and he passed it. And this polygraph was done by the New Orleans Police Department, because these were police detectives. And they came to Washington, and Cornwell suspended them. I didn't give you permission to do that, Paul. You should be so happy that we gave a major witness a polygraph. And look, let's see where this leads. Instead, they were stopped from doing anything further, and they had to sit on their hands. From then on, they felt guilty about taking the money. I wanted them to come to Dr. Wecht's conference so much. I wanted you all to see, here are the real investigators, because they're alive, here they are. And they wouldn't do it. And I think the reason is that they didn't even know at that time that Gary Cornwell would be here. And I think they felt embarrassed, because these are such strong investigators. They did so much, and then to be stopped and not be permitted to do the work that they could do so well. They were just very upset about that.